Questions for oral answer, and the first question stands in the name of Craig Foss.
Mr. Speaker.
Craig Foss.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and reads, what does the latest GDP data show about New Zealand's recent growth performance?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, revised GDP data up to the September quarter of 2009 was released just before Christmas. It revealed that the economy had, for a number of years, been growing more slowly than previously reported. In fact, GDP output in 2009 was barely above the level 4 years before, that is 2005. In the 3 years to September 2008, the economy grew under the revised figures by less than 1% per year through the third term of the last government and before the impact of the global crisis.
Craig Foss.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Minister. How should the economy have performed over this time?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the years 2005 to 2008 were the best of times internationally, and we should have done much better than 0.9% growth per year. Inflation was low, our terms of trade were high, the population was growing.
Order. A point of order has been called.
Mr. Speaker, I sat back because I thought you might have intervened. The question was, how should the economy have performed in this period? That is something for which that Minister has no responsibility whatsoever.
Speaking the point of order, the Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Look, it's quite clear that the present Minister of Finance had no responsibility for that, and I don't think he'd want it. And I can also see Trevor Mallard's point trying to avoid responsibility, but the question was what reports had been received, and the obvious supplementary, having received those reports, is what would the Minister of Finance think? It follows directly from the primary question.
Order. There's a point of order being considered, and the House should be silent. The point of order raised by Honourable Trevor Mallard is marginal. What I'll be listening for carefully is that the Minister of Finance does not get into criticising or commenting on particularly the policies of the previous government for which he has no responsibility. He does have some reporting responsibility for what happened during that period, and so he can comment on what happened, what maybe should have happened, but I do not want to hear criticism of the previous government's policies. The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, during that period the economy should have grown at the same rate as other developed countries, but it grew at less than half the growth rate of the Western economies, and it should have grown the same rate as Australia, but it grew at less than 1/3 the rate of Australia. To have delivered so little growth through that period of such favourable times was a remarkable underachievement.
The Honourable Jim Anderton.
Mr. Speaker, can the Minister tell the House whether the GDP growth of New Zealand caught up to or passed that of Australia over the 15 months under the National-led government, or has it fallen further behind?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, it hasn't caught up, and that's because not so much because of the global crisis, everyone's had to suffer from that, but because the New Zealand economy was in such a weak and lopsided position when the global crisis came along.
Craig Foss.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Minister. To the Minister, to what does he attribute this performance of low GDP growth over recent years?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in the first case it's important to understand that the revised GDP figures show that an economy we thought had been performing poorly was actually performing very poorly. And at that time, for instance, government spending rose by 50% over 5 years, causing persistently high interest rates and depriving our export sector of the resources it needed to thrive. And the result is we have a very anaemic export sector that's been in recession for 5 years.
Craig Foss.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Minister. What steps is the government taking to improve New Zealand's GDP growth?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's statement last week laid out a comprehensive plan to lift economic performance and to shift economic growth towards savings and exports and less reliance on borrowing and consumption. The New Zealand economy in recent years has been far too dependent on spending more than we earn, borrowing to fill the difference, and we have an export sector that's now been shrinking for the last 5 years.
Question number 2, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.